I never thought my parents would be the biggest obstacle in my relationship. But here I am, 32 years old, in love with an amazing man, and still fighting for my family's approval like I'm a rebellious teenager. Adam and I met at a charity event 2 years ago. I was volunteering for an animal rescue organization, and he was there as a guest, looking completely out of place in his slightly wrinkled button-up shirt and scuffed shoes. He struck up a conversation about the ridiculous price of the auctioned items, and I laughed because I agreed. We ended up talking the whole night. He was charming, funny, and had this quiet confidence that drew me in. We started dating not long after, and those first few months were perfect. Adam wasn't flashy or rich, but he was kind, supportive, and always made me feel safe. He worked as a freelance web developer, and while his income wasn't stable, he managed. I had a solid job in marketing, so money was never an issue between us. But my parents, they saw things differently. My mom and dad are traditional, old-fashioned, and painfully judgmental. They believe a man should be the provider, the one with a stable career, a house, and financial security before even thinking about marriage. To them, Adam was a failure. When I first introduced him, they were polite but cold. My mother, Elizabeth, served dinner as if she were feeding a stranger who might rob the house. My father, Richard, kept the conversation painfully superficial, avoiding anything personal. My younger sister, Sophia, tried to keep things light, but I could tell she felt the tension too. After dinner, when Adam left, my parents wasted no time. "He's a nice guy, but nice doesn't pay the bills," my father said, swirling his whiskey. "He's not from our world, Olivia," my mother added, shaking her head. "You deserve stability." I argued, I defended him, but it was useless. They had already decided he wasn't good enough. The situation escalated when I spent the holidays with Adam's family instead of my own. His parents, Robert and Linda, were warm and welcoming. They weren't rich, but they were full of love, and that meant more to me than a fancy Christmas dinner at my parents' mansion. My mother was furious. She accused me of disrespecting family traditions. My father sent me a passive-aggressive text. "Hope your new family treats you well." Things only got worse from there. My parents started finding subtle ways to make Adam feel unwelcome. They wouldn't invite him to family gatherings. My mother would make snide comments about responsible men whenever I visited alone. My father once asked if Adam was still playing around with websites, or if he had found a real job. The final straw came when Sophia pulled me aside one evening. "They're trying to set you up with someone else," she whispered. I laughed at first, thinking she was joking, but she wasn't. My parents had arranged a dinner with a man named Daniel, son of one of my father's business partners. He was successful, wealthy, and, according to my mother, much more suitable. I confronted them immediately. "Are you serious?" I shouted. "I'm in a relationship, and you're trying to set me up with someone else?" "You're making a mistake, Olivia," my father said, his voice calm but firm. "Adam is not the man for you. Because he doesn't have a six-figure salary? Because he can't provide for you," my mother snapped. "Because he doesn't share our faith. Because in 10 years, you'll regret this decision, and we're trying to save you from that." That was it. I left their house that night feeling like I had lost my family. Adam tried to comfort me, but I could tell it weighed on him. He hated being the reason I was at odds with my parents. He even suggested we take a break, just so I could fix things with my family. But I refused. I wasn't going to let them control my life. Then, out of nowhere, my mother showed up at my apartment. "I just want to talk," she said, her expression softer than I had seen in months. I let her in, hoping, just maybe, she had changed her mind. "Your father and I are only trying to protect you," she said. "You don't understand now, but you will." I sighed. "Mom, I love Adam. Why can't that be enough?" She took my hand. "Because love isn't enough when life gets hard." Then she handed me a folder. Inside were financial records, Adam's. Bank statements, credit reports, even some debt he had from a failed business years ago. I felt sick. "How did you get this?" I asked, my voice shaking. "We did what we had to do," she said. "Do you really want to build a future with this?" I threw the folder across the room. "That's private. That's his life. Do you have any idea how disgusting this is?" My mother stood, unfazed. "You can hate me now, but one day you'll thank me." I kicked her out. That night, I told Adam everything. He was devastated. Not just by what they had done, but by the fact that I had seen his financial struggles, the part of his life he had always been insecure about. "I understand if you want to leave," he said quietly. I took his hand. "I'm not going anywhere." I thought that would be the end of it. That my parents had done their worst. I was wrong. A few weeks later, Adam's freelance work dried up, and he was struggling. My father saw this as an opportunity. He offered Adam a job at one of his companies, on one condition. He had to break up with me. Adam refused, of course. But the fact that my father had the audacity to offer made me see just how far they were willing to go. I went no contact. I blocked my parents, cut them out completely. Sophia was the only one I kept in touch with, and even she begged me to just give them time. It's been 6 months now. Adam and I are still together, still strong. But my parents, they're still waiting for me to come to my senses. I don't know if they ever will accept him. And honestly, I don't know if I care anymore. I never thought introducing my boyfriend to my parents would feel like an impossible task. But after a year of trying, of phone calls, invitations, and carefully planned meetings, it became clear they had no intention of ever meeting Adam. I had been dating Adam for over 2 years, and he was the best partner I had ever had. He was thoughtful, funny, and genuinely cared about me in a way no one else ever had. But to my parents, none of that mattered. They saw him as a financial liability, a man who couldn't provide the stable future they believed I deserved. At first, I was patient. I figured they just needed time. My family had always been traditional, and I knew they struggled with change. My younger sister, Sophia, had gone through something similar when she married her husband, Eric. He wasn't from the right background, as my mother put it, and they had tried to push her towards someone more suitable. But eventually they accepted him. I hoped the same would happen with Adam. It didn't. The first time I brought up meeting Adam, my mother, Elizabeth, barely looked up from her tea. "We're very busy this month, Olivia. What about next month?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "We'll see," she said, already moving on to another topic. I tried again a few weeks later. I invited them for coffee, something casual. No pressure. They declined. Then I invited them for dinner. They were too tired. When I suggested a quick video call so they could at least say hello, my father, Richard, scoffed. "I don't do video calls, Olivia. I'm not a teenager." Every excuse felt like a slap in the face. Adam, to his credit, tried not to let it bother him. "They'll come around," he'd say. "They just need time." But as months passed, it became clear they weren't going to come around. I decided to push harder. I organized a small family dinner at my apartment. Just my parents, Sophia, her husband Eric, and Adam. I spent days preparing, making sure everything was perfect. I cooked their favorite dishes, cleaned the apartment from top to bottom, and even set the table with the fancy dinnerware my mother always loved. They didn't show up. They didn't even call. I sat there, staring at the untouched food, my stomach twisting in knots. Adam tried to comfort me, but I could see the hurt in his eyes too. It wasn't just about him. It was about what this said about me. That they didn't respect my choices, that they didn't trust me to know what was best for my own life. Sophia was furious. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, grabbing her phone. "I'm calling them." She put them on speaker. My mother answered, her voice calm, as if nothing had happened. "Mom," Sophia said sharply. "Why aren't you here?" "We told Olivia we weren't coming." My mother replied coolly. "No, you didn't," I cut in. "You just ignored me." A long pause. Then my father spoke. "Olivia, we're not interested in pretending to support something we don't approve of." My hands clenched into fists. "So you're just going to ignore my relationship?" "We're not ignoring anything," my mother said. "We're choosing not to be part of a mistake." A mistake. That was the moment I realized they weren't just avoiding Adam. They were actively rejecting him, and me. I hung up. After that, things got worse. They stopped inviting me to family events, stopped calling as often. When I visited them alone, they acted as if Adam didn't exist. If I mentioned him, they changed the subject. My father, usually so talkative, would suddenly check his watch. My mother would ask if I had thought things through. The worst part? They started reaching out to my ex, Mark. Mark was the perfect son-in-law in their eyes. He came from money, had a high-paying job in finance, and shared their religious beliefs. We had dated for 3 years before breaking up, and it had taken me a long time to move on. But now, suddenly, he was back in the picture. "Mark asked about you the other day," my mother said casually over lunch. I set my fork down. "Did he?" "He was always so kind," she continued. "And he really cared about you." Sophia rolled her eyes. "Mom, stop." "I'm just saying," my mother said innocently. "People change. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to have coffee with him." I laughed. "I have a boyfriend." "Or did you forget?" My mother sighed. "We're just concerned, Olivia. We don't want you to struggle." I had heard enough. I grabbed my bag and left. That night, I told Adam everything. He listened quietly, his jaw tightening as I spoke. "So they'd rather see you with someone they approve of than with someone who actually makes you happy," he said bitterly. "Pretty much." Adam shook his head. "I don't want to come between you and your family." "You're not," I said firmly. "They are." I tried one last time. I invited them to dinner at a restaurant. Neutral ground, no pressure. I even made a reservation at their favorite place. An hour before we were supposed to meet, my mother called. "We won't be coming," she said, not even bothering to give an excuse this time. I exhaled slowly. "Mom, do you even care about how this makes me feel?" "Olivia," she said, her tone patient but condescending, "one day you'll thank us for this." I hung up. I sat in that restaurant with Adam and Sophia, staring at the empty seats across from us. It wasn't just about Adam anymore. This was about control. About them refusing to accept that I was an adult, capable of making my own choices. And as much as it hurt, I was done trying. I had tried everything. Coffee invitations, family dinners, even casual video calls. Nothing worked. My parents refused to meet Adam, refused to acknowledge our relationship, and refused to even consider the possibility that they might be wrong about him. But if they wouldn't listen to me, maybe they'd listen to someone else. That's when I came up with a new plan. My parents had a close-knit social circle, mostly old friends from their business connections and religious community. But not all of them were as rigid as my parents. Some were more open-minded, more understanding. People they respected. So I decided to bring them in. I planned a dinner at our apartment, inviting some of my parents' oldest friends, Margaret and Peter Holloway, an older couple who had always been kind to me growing up, Vincent and Laura Dawson, who were more modern and had a son my age, and Anthony Carter, my father's longtime friend, a sharp but reasonable man who wasn't afraid to challenge outdated thinking. If I could get them to see Adam for who he really was, maybe, just maybe, they could influence my parents. Adam, ever the optimist, was fully on board. He insisted on cooking the entire meal himself. I want them to see me for who I am, he said. Not as some abstract problem your parents made up. The night of the dinner, our apartment smelled amazing. Adam had spent all day in the kitchen, preparing a mix of dishes that he knew would impress, elegant but not pretentious. He even researched wine pairings to go with each course. As our guests arrived, I felt a mix of excitement and nerves. Margaret and Peter were the first to show up, greeting me warmly before turning to Adam. "So you're the mysterious boyfriend," Peter said, shaking Adam's hand. "I have to admit, we were curious." Adam smiled. "Hopefully, I'm not too much of a disappointment." Margaret chuckled. "Well, the food smells divine, so you're off to a good start." Vincent and Laura arrived next, followed by Anthony. They were all polite, but I could sense their curiosity. My parents had clearly painted a negative picture of Adam, and I knew I had a long night ahead of me proving them wrong. We started with appetizers, perfectly seasoned bruschetta and a creamy truffle risotto. As we ate, the conversation remained light, with Adam effortlessly engaging them in discussions about travel, food, and current events. Then came the main course, roast lamb with garlic mashed potatoes and sautéed vegetables. As Adam served the plates, Vincent raised an eyebrow. "I have to say, I wasn't expecting this level of effort," he admitted. Adam laughed. "Well, I figured if I couldn't win you over with charm, I'd try with food." That got a round of laughter, and I saw the tension in the room ease. Halfway through dinner, the conversation shifted. Margaret, always the blunt one, leaned forward. "Olivia, why exactly haven't your parents met Adam yet?" The table went quiet. I hesitated, then decided to be honest. "Because they don't approve of him." Peter frowned. "Why not?" Adam set his fork down, his expression calm but serious. "Because I'm not wealthy. Because I don't come from their world. And because I don't share their faith." Vincent let out a low whistle. "Wow, that's a lot." Anthony, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. "And what do you think, Adam? Do you see a future with Olivia despite all of this?" Adam met his gaze without hesitation. "I love Olivia. I want to build a life with her. I may not have the financial status her parents want, but I work hard. I take care of the people I love. And I'm not going anywhere." Something shifted in the room. Margaret smiled. "Well, that's all I needed to hear." Peter nodded. "I have to admit, I was expecting someone different." Adam smirked. "A gold digger?" Peter chuckled. "Something like that." Laura leaned forward. "Honestly, Olivia, your parents are being ridiculous. They raised you to be independent, to make your own choices. Why can't they see that?" I sighed. "Because they think they know better." That's when Anthony shook his head. "I'm going to talk to Richard." I blinked. "Wait, what?" "I've known your father for over 30 years, he said. "He listens to me. And I think it's time someone tells him he's being a damn fool." I hadn't expected that. Neither had Adam. "You'd really do that?" Anthony shrugged. "If your biggest flaw is that you're not rich, then you're better than half the men in our circle." The dinner ended on a high note. Our guests left with a new perspective, and I felt hopeful for the first time in a long time. But I had no idea just how much chaos this would cause. Anthony didn't waste time. He met my father for lunch the next day and confronted him directly. "I met Adam," he told him. "And Richard, you're making a mistake." My father was furious. He accused Anthony of interfering, of not understanding the bigger picture. But Anthony didn't back down. "You're pushing your daughter away," he warned. "And if you keep this up, you're going to lose her." My father didn't take it well. That night, he called me, his voice cold. "So, now you're sending my friends to lecture me?" I exhaled. "I didn't send anyone, Dad. They met Adam and formed their own opinions." "Well, their opinions don't matter, don't they?" I shot back. "You respect Anthony. You trust him. If he sees what you refuse to see, maybe you should start asking yourself why." Silence. Then, in the lowest, most controlled voice, my father said, "This conversation is over." And he hung up. I stared at my phone, my heart pounding. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning of a new fight. I should have known my parents wouldn't take it well. After Anthony and the others confronted them, my father went silent for days. No calls, no texts, nothing. My mother, however, was not so restrained. She showed up at my apartment unannounced, her face tight with controlled anger. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she said the moment I opened the door. I sighed, already exhausted. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb, Olivia," she snapped. "Inviting our friends to dinner? Manipulating them into taking your side? Do you have any idea how humiliating this is for us?" I laughed, though there was no humor in it. Manipulating them? I just introduced them to Adam. They formed their own opinions. "Because you charmed them," she said bitterly. "And because you had him cook some fancy meal like some desperate showman." My jaw tightened. Or maybe, just maybe, they actually liked him. She scoffed. "Of course they liked him. That's what men like him do, Olivia. They make you feel special while they take everything from you." I stared at her in disbelief. Men like him. You don't see it, she said, shaking her head. But everyone else does. Your father and I have had to deal with the fallout from this nonsense. People are talking, Olivia. They're saying he's using you. I felt my stomach drop. What? She crossed her arms. What did you expect? That people wouldn't notice? That they wouldn't talk? A successful, well-educated woman suddenly dating a man with no money, no real career, no stability? Of course, they're going to assume the worst. I felt my hands tremble. And let me guess, you didn't correct them? She gave me a cold, pitying look. Why would we? I slammed the door in her face. The rumors spread like wildfire. At first, it was subtle. A few side glances at social gatherings, an awkward silence when my name was mentioned. Then came the whispers. Friends who had once been warm and welcoming suddenly became distant. Sophia was the one who first told me the extent of it. You're not going to believe this, she said over the phone. Mom and Dad are telling people that Adam is after your money. I gritted my teeth. Unbelievable. Oh, it gets worse, she continued. They're saying he's unstable. That he's struggling financially and that you're supporting him. That he's embarrassing. That last word stung. Adam and I had always split things fairly. Sure, I had a stable salary and he had a more unpredictable income, but we made it work. He wasn't some gold digger, and the fact that my parents were pushing this narrative made my blood boil. Then the real damage started. My parents had built their reputation on success, stability, and social status. They had spent decades cultivating relationships with wealthy, like-minded people. But now, their own stubbornness was starting to cost them. Anthony wasn't the only one who disagreed with them. Margaret and Peter were appalled by their behavior and weren't shy about saying so. Laura Dawson, who had always been respected among my mother's friends, openly questioned why my parents were so obsessed with my dating life. And slowly, the cracks in their perfect social circle began to show. One by one, their friends started distancing themselves. Dinner invitations dried up. Conversations became more strained. My parents were used to being admired, respected, even feared, in a way. But now, they were just stubborn old-fashioned people refusing to accept change. And society does not tolerate weakness. My mother called me one evening, her voice unusually sharp. Are you happy now? She demanded. I leaned back on my couch, rubbing my temples. What are you talking about now? We were uninvited from the Holloway's gala, she hissed. Uninvited, Olivia. Do you understand how humiliating that is? I smirked. Guess Margaret and Peter don't want to be associated with bigots. This isn't a joke, she snapped. Your father and I built our lives around these connections. And now, thanks to you, we're being pushed out. I shrugged. Maybe you should have thought about that before you started spreading lies about my relationship. She exhaled sharply. This isn't over. Oh, it is, I said, my voice calm. Because I'm done playing your games. And for the first time in my life, I hung up on her first. I knew my parents wouldn't go down without a fight. After their friends started turning against them and their social standing began to slip, they did the one thing they knew best: damage control. But this time, their strategy wasn't about fixing things. It was about making me the villain. They called for a family meeting. Sophia gave me the heads up first. They're planning something, she warned over the phone. They've invited everyone. Extended family, close friends, even some of Dad's business partners. I raised an eyebrow. Business partners? What does this have to do with them? I have no idea, she admitted. But I can tell you one thing, it's not just a family discussion. They want to put on a show. I exhaled slowly, gripping my phone tighter. Fine. I'll go. Sophia hesitated. Are you sure? I need to face them eventually, I said. Might as well do it on my terms. The meeting was held at my parents' house, in the massive dining room they usually reserved for holiday gatherings. When I walked in, I immediately noticed how carefully they had staged everything. The long mahogany table was set, but not for dinner, just coffee and tea, making it clear this wasn't meant to be a warm gathering. My parents sat at the head of the table, with my father's closest allies positioned near them. My Uncle Gregory, a cold businessman who had always treated me like an investment rather than a niece. My Aunt Miriam, my mother's older sister and a notorious gossip, and Charles Benson, one of my father's longtime business associates. On the other side of the table sat Sophia, her husband Eric, and a few other cousins and relatives who had remained neutral in all of this. I could tell some of them were uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as if they weren't sure why they were even there. I took a deep breath and sat down. My father cleared his throat. We've called this meeting because there seems to be a misunderstanding in the family, he said, his voice measured. Lies and rumors have been spreading, and we think it's important to set the record straight. I raised an eyebrow. Lies and rumors? You mean the ones you started about Adam? My mother sighed dramatically. Olivia, we are trying to have a civil discussion. Oh, like the civil discussions where you told people Adam was using me for money? I leaned back in my chair. Because that seems pretty relevant. Uncle Gregory frowned. Your parents are only concerned about your well-being. No, I corrected, my voice calm. They're concerned about their reputation. Let's not pretend otherwise. A murmur spread through the room. Sophia smirked slightly but kept quiet. My father's jaw tightened. We have every right to be concerned. You're making choices that will affect not only your future but the family's as well. I tilted my head. Oh? And how exactly is me being happy a problem for the family? My mother placed a hand over her heart, her classic "I'm the victim here" gesture. We are simply trying to protect you, Olivia. Adam is not. Not what? I cut in. Not rich enough? Not successful enough? Not from the right religious background. Silence. I nodded. That's what I thought. Aunt Miriam cleared her throat. Olivia, dear, your parents only want what's best for you. We all do. But you have to admit, Adam, well, he doesn't seem like a suitable match. I turned my gaze to her. Have you even met Adam? She hesitated. Well, no, but... Then how would you know? More murmurs. I took a deep breath, my voice steady. Since we're all here, let's lay everything out. Adam is kind. He is loyal. He treats me with respect, which is more than I can say for this family right now. He has never once made me feel like I am less than, or that I need to earn his approval. He doesn't belittle me, manipulate me, or try to control my decisions. Can any of you say the same for how you've treated me? Silence. My father's grip tightened on the table. We raised you to have standards, Olivia. I gave a small, bitter smile. No. You raised me to obey you. Sophia nodded approvingly, and I saw a few other relatives exchange glances. Then Charles Benson, my father's business associate, cleared his throat. Richard, I have to be honest here. This doesn't seem like Olivia's problem. It seems like yours. My father stiffened. Excuse me. Charles gestured around the room. We've all known Olivia since she was a child. She's smart, capable, and knows her own mind. If she says Adam is a good man, I don't see why that should be up for debate. My father's face darkened. You don't understand. No, Margaret Holloway, who had apparently been invited despite my parents' rocky relationship with her, interjected. We understand just fine. The question is, do you? I watched my parents' faces carefully. They hadn't expected this. They had planned for a confrontation where they would have the upper hand, where they would be the victims of my supposed recklessness. Instead, the people they had invited were starting to turn against them. Aunt Miriam cleared her throat again, looking flustered. Well, perhaps. No, Miriam, my mother snapped, her composure breaking. Enough of this. She turned back to me, her eyes blazing. You don't see it now, but you will. One day when you're struggling, when he can't provide for you, you'll realize we were right. And when that happens, don't expect us to clean up your mess. I nodded slowly. So that's it then? You'd rather lose me than admit you're wrong. My father stood abruptly. We are not wrong. I met his gaze evenly. Then I guess you've made your choice. The room was silent. My parents looked around, realizing they no longer had the control they once did. The power they held over this family was slipping through their fingers, and they hated it. Without another word, they stormed out of the room. I sat there for a moment, exhaling slowly. Then, one by one, people started speaking up. Olivia, if you ever need anything, let me know, Charles said, giving me a firm nod. Margaret squeezed my hand. Your parents will come around. But until then, you have more support than you think. Sophia grinned. Well, that went better than I expected. I looked around the room and realized something. I hadn't lost my family. Not really. I had just lost the people who refused to love me unconditionally. After the family meeting, it became painfully clear that my parents had no intention of changing their views, but what they hadn't anticipated was how quickly the world around them would change instead. Their social circle, the same people who had once admired and respected them, now saw them as relics of an outdated way of thinking. Their closest friends, the ones they had spent decades cultivating relationships with, slowly but surely began to distance themselves. It wasn't immediate, but I could see the shift happening. Invitations to events became fewer. Their phone calls went unanswered, and even their usual dinner parties, which had once been filled with laughter and business discussions, now felt emptier. My parents had spent their lives building a reputation of power, influence, and control, but now, without anyone left to impress, all they had was each other. I hadn't spoken to them since that disastrous family gathering, and at first, I expected some sort of retaliation. I thought my father would call me in anger, demand an explanation, or at the very least, try to reassert his authority over me, but the call never came. My mother, who had spent years manipulating situations to her advantage, remained eerily silent. The only updates I received came through Sophia, who, despite her frustrations with them, still kept in contact. She told me that my father was furious, convinced that I had orchestrated a plan to turn their friends against them, while my mother, ever the actress, pretended as though nothing was wrong, even as her closest friends abandoned her one by one. It was almost poetic in a way. They had spent so much time looking down on others, so much time crafting an image of superiority, and yet here they were, completely isolated, their arrogance and unwillingness to change leaving them with no one but themselves. My father's company suffered as well. Business partners who had once respected his name started pulling away, unwilling to associate with someone who had become the subject of hushed whispers and judgmental glances. My mother, who had always thrived in social settings, found herself uninvited from the very gatherings she used to host, and even Aunt Miriam, who had once blindly supported her, was now keeping her distance, unwilling to be dragged down with them. Despite knowing all of this, despite hearing about how far they had fallen, there was still a small part of me that hoped they would reach out, that maybe, just maybe, they would finally see reason. But deep down, I knew better. My parents were not the kind of people who admitted when they were wrong. They were not the kind of people who apologized or reflected on their mistakes. To them, losing everything would always be preferable to swallowing their pride, and I had spent my entire life being the collateral damage of their stubbornness. I had wasted years trying to make them see me, trying to make them proud, trying to fit into the mold they had designed for me, but I was done chasing after something that would never come. Sitting at my desk one evening, I stared at a blank sheet of paper, knowing that there was only one thing left to do. A letter felt like the right way to end this chapter, a way to put everything into words without the interruptions, without the arguments, without the dismissive sighs and judgmental glares. I picked up my pen and began writing, my words coming out steady and certain, each sentence a final nail in the coffin of the relationship I had fought so hard to salvage. I told them that I understood their position, that I had spent years trying to be the daughter they wanted, trying to earn their love, but that I could no longer allow myself to be treated as though my happiness was a mistake. I told them that Adam was the best thing that had ever happened to me, that he was kind, patient, and loved me in a way that they never had, and that I refused to let them belittle him any longer. I told them that I was done seeking their approval, done begging for their acceptance, done trying to prove my worth to people who refused to see it. I told them that I wished things had been different, that I had spent years hoping they would change, but that I had finally come to understand that they never would. I told them that if they ever decided to let go of their pride, to truly see me for who I was rather than who they wanted me to be, then maybe one day, there could be room for reconciliation. But until that day came, this was goodbye. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in an envelope, and mailed it the next morning without hesitation. There was no fear, no second-guessing, no lingering doubts. I had spent too long carrying the weight of their expectations, but I wasn't their burden to bear anymore. I was free. Days passed, then weeks, and there was no response. No phone call, no message, no acknowledgement of my words. They had made their decision just as I had made mine. They had chosen their pride over their daughter, and I had chosen my happiness over their approval. And for the first time in my life, that choice didn't feel like a loss. It felt like freedom. A year ago, I had walked away from my parents for good. I had mailed them my final words, drawn a firm boundary, and stepped into a new life where their approval no longer dictated my happiness. I expected the weight of that decision to crush me, but it never did. If anything, it felt like I had finally taken a deep breath after years of suffocating under their expectations. Adam and I built something real in the aftermath of that storm. Without the constant stress of their disapproval hanging over my head, I was able to focus on my own life, my own goals, my own joy. We traveled, something I had always wanted to do but never had the courage to before. I had spent so long worrying about what my parents thought of me that I had forgotten what it was like to just live. We took a last-minute trip to Italy, where we spent 2 weeks getting lost in the narrow streets of Rome, eating our way through tiny, family-run trattorias, and watching the sunset over the Amalfi Coast with glasses of wine in hand. Back home, our apartment became more than just a place we lived. It became a home in every sense of the word. Adam started taking on bigger projects, finally securing the kind of stability that my parents had always deemed impossible for him. I got a promotion at work, one that had been a long time coming, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to call my parents to tell them. Their validation no longer mattered, and that realization was the most freeing thing of all. What I hadn't expected was how much support we would receive from everyone else. My relationship with Sophia grew stronger than ever. She and Eric were our closest friends, the people we spent weekends with, the ones we called when we had good news or needed advice. Aunt Miriam, surprisingly, had reached out months after the family confrontation, admitting that she had been too quick to take my parents' side. Even some of my father's former business associates, people who had once been firmly on my parents' team, had started quietly reaching out, congratulating me on my independence. My parents, however, stayed silent. I hadn't expected anything different, but as months passed, that silence became its own answer. They had made their choice, and I had made mine. I no longer wondered if they would change their minds, no longer replayed old conversations in my head, no longer searched for signs that they missed me. They had built a life around control and status, and when they lost those things, they had chosen isolation over change. That wasn't my burden to carry. Then, one day, a simple white envelope arrived in the mail. I knew who it was from before I even opened it. There was no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable, my mother's, precise and elegant as ever. Inside was a holiday card. No letter. No personal message. Just a generic greeting, printed in gold lettering, wishing me a happy holiday season. My name was written at the top, followed by Adam's, which almost made me laugh. After everything, after a year of silence, they couldn't even acknowledge him as anything more than a name on a card. I sat at the kitchen table, turning it over in my hands, waiting for the familiar sting of disappointment to settle in. But it never did. Adam walked in, drying his hands with a dish towel. "What's that?" I slid the card across the table. He read it, then looked up at me. And I shrugged. And nothing. And that was the truth. There was no longing, no ache in my chest, no urge to respond. There was nothing left to say. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I didn't even feel relief. I just felt done. For the first time in my life, my happiness wasn't tied to their approval. And that was the greatest gift of all.